43-year-old Jean Domenico was way too positive and upbeat of a person to complain about her life. In fact, optimism, kindness, and generosity, all those were just some of the words that family and friends used to describe Jean. And those qualities were so obvious in Jean's infectious smile, laughing blue eyes, and warm manner that even total strangers who exchanged just a few words with Jean always left those encounters knowing they'd met a very special kind of person. So, when Jean's coworkers passed by her desk at Oxford Health Plans on that hot New England morning in 2003, no one would have suspected that behind Jean's usual smile and cheerful greeting, Jean had been feeling anything but happy and calm. It was Wednesday, August 6th, and the day was shaping up to be one of the hottest on record in Nashua, New Hampshire, where Jean lived with her 2 teenage children. And when Jean had left her house at 7:45 a.m. that morning, she had spent the 30-minute drive to work going over and over in her mind the events of the last 5 days. Even inside of her air-conditioned car, where she felt comfortable and in control of her surroundings, Jean kept wondering if the decision she had come to on Monday, 2 days earlier, was the right decision, or whether it would just cause even more problems for her and her kids. As a single mom who had ended an abusive marriage 4 years earlier, Jean was no stranger to family drama and the strain of financial hardship, and Jean had always chosen to meet those challenges head-on. After leaving the children's father, Anthony Kazinskis, back in 1999, Jean began working 2 to 3 different jobs at once to put food on the table of their small home in one of Nashua's more modest neighborhoods. Even now, with her full-time job at Oxford Health Plans, Jean still worked a part-time shift at a local convenience store. But despite how busy she was, Jean's primary focus had always been her son, Charlie, now 14 years old, and her daughter, Nicole, who had just turned 16 2 months earlier. The 3 of them had always been very close, and now, aside from still sharing their father's last name, Charlie and Nicole spent almost all their time with their mom. And no matter how crazy her schedule was, Jean had always made sure that both children were well looked after when she was at work, and that the neighbors always kept an eye out for her ex-husband. Not only did Anthony owe Jean $11,000 in unpaid child support, but also Jean wanted to guard against the possibility that Anthony would show up unannounced and uninvited at the house when she was not there. But the turmoil Jean was feeling on this particular morning had nothing to do with Anthony or money or anything else that Jean felt like she could fix through hard work and good parenting, 2 things that came naturally to Jean. In fact, it had been Jean's efforts over the last 2 years to help guide Nicole through a difficult adolescence that had seemed to backfire in ways that Jean had just never expected. Driving along the familiar route to work, Jean thought back to Nicole just before she turned 14 and when their lives had seemed a lot simpler. While still in middle school, Nicole had been an outstanding student whose natural shyness had not stopped her from joining the school chorus and bubbling over at home with news about what she was doing and reading. And when Jean had heard other moms talk about the arguments or fights they had with their teenage daughters, Jean had just felt grateful that she and Nicole had always gotten along so well and had always enjoyed doing things and going places together. But when Nicole turned 14 and headed into high school, her shyness turned into awkwardness and intense self-consciousness about her weight and looks. Jean had been heartbroken the evening she found Nicole sitting on the bed in her tiny upstairs room using scissors to cut pictures of herself into pieces, and hearing Nicole describe herself as fat and ugly. After that, it wasn't long before Nicole, who had also dropped out of the school chorus, became the target of bullying. Driving along Interstate 293, Jean gripped the steering wheel more tightly, remembering one incident when a group of girls pulled Nicole's pants down to her ankles, leaving Nicole fully exposed from the waist down to laughter and stares from surrounding students. Jean had gone straight to the school principal when she heard about the incident, but that had not stopped the whispering and teasing. And then, just when Nicole seemed to be sinking into depression, the shy 14-year-old with low self-esteem had met 17-year-old Billy Sullivan in an online chat room. Billy lived 100 miles away in Willimantic, Connecticut, but the popular internet technology called Instant Messenger had allowed the 2 of them to form a close and personal relationship long before they actually ever met in person. And at first, it took Jean a while to connect the improvement in Nicole's mood and confidence to the increasing amount of time Nicole had started spending on the internet. And Jean certainly didn't know that within just 5 days of their virtual meeting, Billy and Nicole had already declared their undying love for one another. It was only when Jean's phone bill blew up with long-distance phone charges for calls from their home at 6 Dumaine Avenue in Nashua, New Hampshire, to a number more than 2 hours south in Connecticut that Jean realized that Nicole had found her first real boyfriend. But what Jean just could not have expected, given the physical distance between Nicole and Billy, was how seriously Nicole and Billy would begin to take their relationship. And when Jean had finally relented and agreed to drive Nicole to Connecticut so Nicole could actually meet Billy for the first time, Jean was certainly not prepared for how hysterical Nicole became when the 8-hour supervised visit ended and Nicole and Jean turned north and headed home to New Hampshire. On one hand, Jean knew that what she was seeing in Nicole was the kind of drama and intensity that only a teenager could bring to first love, and that eventually the relationship would probably play itself out. Especially since Nicole had confided that Billy, for all his declarations of love for Nicole, had at least one other girlfriend, also Nicole's age. And when Nicole and Billy argued, Billy had let it drop that he'd been, quote, forced, his word, to seek comfort with that other girlfriend. On the other hand, Jean also knew that it was just not possible for her to control the feelings and actions of these two young people. And if all Jean did was say no to Nicole and point out flaws in her relationship with Billy, then chances were good that it would be Jean who Nicole would reject, not Billy. So, when Billy had arrived, unannounced and uninvited, at Jean's house that previous Friday, August 1st, Jean had not been pleased, but she had also, reluctantly, allowed him to stay. As Billy explained to Jean, he'd been given a vacation from his job as a line cook at the local McDonald's near his house in Willimantic, and since he'd also just recently gotten his driver's license and a car of his own, he'd wanted to surprise Nicole with an extended visit. Over the entire 15 months that the two had been together, they'd only actually seen one another in person 4 or 5 times, and never for more than just a few days. In agreeing to the visit, Jean had reasoned that at least this way, she would be able to keep a close eye on Nicole and Billy, who were not permitted to spend any time together alone in Nicole's upstairs bedroom. It had not been the most convenient arrangement in the world. Jean's house was a small but traditional Cape house, a center front entrance that led into the living and dining rooms to either side, with the kitchen and 2 small bedrooms towards the back. Nicole's bedroom, with its sloped ceiling, was on the 2nd floor, along with an equally tiny bathroom. Which meant that when Jean's 14-year-old son, Charlie, wasn't staying over with friends, as he often did, there was no spare bedroom for Billy. And Jean had to tiptoe around Billy, sleeping on the downstairs couch when she got up in the morning to start her day and tidy up the kitchen before leaving for one of her 2 jobs. It wasn't that Billy seemed like a bad kid. He had a steady job at McDonald's. He lived with his single mom and his 4 sisters, but he was not a freeloader. It was clear he loved his family and contributed a regular chunk of his hourly wages to help with household expenses. Tall and lanky, with a military-style buzz cut and dark brown eyes and a smattering of teenage pimples that made him look younger than he really was, he was generally polite and handsome. And Jean had to admit that Billy's frequent declarations about how beautiful and smart and talented Nicole was had, at least in the beginning, done a lot to improve her daughter's self-esteem. Still, Jean was glad the visit was coming to an end, several days sooner than Billy and Nicole had planned, so today was the last day that he and Nicole would have together before Billy returned to Willimantic. The last day, Jean would step outside and see Billy's black Chevrolet Cavalier sitting in their driveway. Just walking by the car that morning on her way to her own car, Jean had thought of that incident at dinner on Sunday, 3 days earlier. Wanting to make Billy feel welcome, Jean had spent the entire afternoon in the kitchen cooking a big dinner for all of them. Jean had been surprised when Billy had looked over the serving dishes and hot food that covered the table that evening and commented that it had been a while since he'd had a complete meal. When Jean had looked up from her plate, saying, "Really?" Billy had interpreted her comment as a veiled insult directed at Billy's own mother, as though Peg Sullivan were not as good a cook or as good of a mother as Jean herself was. Remembering the exchange now, Jean just shook her head. For her, Billy's hostile reaction had set the tone of the whole week, and now she was just glad the visit with Billy would soon be over. Determined to keep that fact uppermost in her thoughts, by the time Jean had arrived at work, she had regained most of her outward good cheer. She was scheduled to spend the day training a new employee, and that was something Jean enjoyed and looked forward to. She liked making sure that new hires felt comfortable and welcome and competent, and the training and orientation materials she'd be using were already neatly organized on Jean's work desk and computer. So, half an hour later, as Jean looked up to greet the new employee, it would have taken a very close observer to notice the faint lines of strain on Jean's otherwise open and smiling face. And throughout the day, that close observer did walk by Jean's desk several times to smile and say hello, but it wasn't until 4:30 on that Wednesday afternoon that Chris McGowan, Jean's fiancé and fellow Oxford Health Plans employee, stopped by long enough to have a real conversation with the woman he loved. Ever since Chris had met Jean on his first day of work 2 years ago, Chris had been completely smitten by this outgoing and friendly woman. A confirmed bachelor whose one long-term relationship had ended in the late 1980s, Chris had not been looking to date anyone, any more than Jean had been. By 2000, Chris, a stocky Irishman with dark hair and a wide smile under his dark mustache, had settled into a comfortable 3-bedroom ranch house as well as a comfortable routine. For her part, Jean was still recovering from her divorce the year before, and all her time and attention was focused on her kids and on paying the bills. And any spare time that she did have, Jean had spent it on activities like coaching Charlie's Little League baseball team or joining the parent-teacher organization when the children went to the Birch Hill Elementary School. But while that initial spark of attraction that Chris and Jean felt for one another had not lit an instantaneous bonfire, it had ignited something much longer lasting. Chris understood and respected Jean's devotion to her kids, and he was careful not to intrude on Charlie and Nicole's time with their mom. Even now, Chris rarely stayed over at Jean's house except on the weekends, and he was more than happy to wait until both Charlie and Nicole had graduated from high school and begun their own lives before he and Jean got married and lived together. To their respective family and friends, Jean and Chris formed that rare couple who seemed deeply and patiently in love with each other. Although they made a point of keeping their interactions at work very businesslike, Chris never tired of making small gestures that showed how much he cared for Jean, like the bouquet of roses he had delivered to her desk that past Monday. Despite how crowded the Domenico house was now with Billy visiting, Jean had asked Chris to spend as much time there as possible over the last 5 days. Chris got along well with both Charlie and Nicole, and Jean felt better about Nicole and Billy spending so much time together if Chris was also able to keep a watchful eye on both of them. So Chris knew firsthand the stresses Jean had felt that week, and he also knew that just when Jean felt like she really needed all her energy and stamina, she had experienced a few bouts of dizziness and fatigue over the last 2 days that were just not like her. Chris's first thought was that the dizziness had been the result of the highly restrictive diet that Jean had recently started in an effort to lose several pounds that had added a comfortable roundness to her 5'6" frame. And looking down at Jean now, at the end of yet another workday, he wished he could convince her that she was perfect just as she was, and find some way to erase the tiredness he could see in her eyes. Instead, Chris went over the plan they had agreed on for that evening. He would leave work now, head to his house, shower, check his mail, and do a few household chores, grab some clean clothes, and then meet Jean at 60 Main Street at about 7 or 7:30. That would give Jean plenty of time to stop and pick up the pizza she planned to serve for dinner that night and tidy up the house before Chris arrived. But it wasn't until the end of their conversation, when Chris whispered, "I love you," that Jean really switched out of work mode. Standing up suddenly, her eyes bright with affection, Jean put down her papers and pencil and reached up to give Chris a strong, warm hug. And Chris was still thinking about that hug and Jean's reply as he got into his car a few minutes later and headed south from the small town of Hooksett, where Oxford Health Plans was located, to the much larger city of Nashua, where Chris's house was located just a few miles away from Jean's. At times like this, Chris could understand the thrill of togetherness, whether you were a teenager or a middle-aged insurance broker. When Jean had said, "I love you too," Chris felt like he was the luckiest person in the world. True to his word, Chris arrived at Jean's house at 7:15. He'd called her 3 times since leaving his house at 7 to see if there was anything else she wanted him to pick up for dinner. When all 3 calls went to voicemail, Chris assumed that Jean must be out walking the family's 2 dogs, and so he stopped just long enough to grab a bottle of soda for the kids. But when Chris stepped out of his car, he could see both dogs still outside in the backyard of Jean's house. Thinking that Jean must have just gotten back from her walk, Chris made his way around to the front, he climbed the steps to the welcome mat, and then came to a sudden stop. The front door was slightly ajar, but inside no lights were on, and the house was eerily quiet. When Jean didn't answer his shouted greeting, "Are you in there, honey?" Chris pushed the door all the way open and stepped inside. As he did so, it occurred to him that the dogs out back had been behaving strangely, whining and turning in circles, their tails tucked tightly between their back legs. His sense of alarm growing by the second, Chris was so focused on finding Jean that he did not even notice the smashed-up coffee table in the living room or the dark liquid that was splashed across the carpet. It was only when he stepped into the kitchen and his eyes followed the thin beam of light from the open refrigerator door as it slanted down to the linoleum tiles that Chris began to register the full horror of what was in front of him. Jean lay face down on the kitchen floor, her head and shoulders swimming in a thick pool of blood. A moment later, Chris was on his knees next to her, shaking her, gently at first, but then much harder, calling her name over and over again and begging her to please just wake up. When the Nashua Police Department and emergency medical personnel heard the call go out from dispatch reporting a, quote, sudden death in one of the city's quietest neighborhoods, it only took minutes for fire trucks, an ambulance, and police cruisers to pull up outside Jean Domenico's house at 6 Dumaine Avenue. With more than 90,000 residents, Nashua might be the second largest city in New Hampshire, but even in a state with one of the lowest homicide rates in the whole country, murder here in Nashua was very rare. So when Chris had called 911 and described a scene of blood everywhere when he discovered his girlfriend's lifeless body, law enforcement had mobilized all of its local resources, blocking off the entrance to Dumaine Avenue, even to residents, stringing up crime scene tape to hold back the growing crowd of concerned neighbors or curious spectators, and also making sure that Chris McGowan, dazed, disoriented, and covered in blood, did not take a single step without a police officer keeping close watch on him. Chris may have told the 911 dispatcher that it looked to him like Jean had had some sort of terrible accident, maybe fainting and hitting her head on a corner of the stove, but police did not have to wait for emergency medical personnel and later the medical examiner to tell them that this was no accident. In fact, it was just the opposite. Jean had been the victim of the most horrific attack that responding officers and detectives had ever seen. And since Chris was the person who had discovered Jean's body, and he was the boyfriend, always a person of interest in homicide cases, he had instantly become the #1 prime suspect, especially when he had no alibi for the time he claimed to have spent at home by himself after work and before finding Jean's body. As the first of Jean's neighbors began gathering outside to ask police what was happening, Chris was bundled into the back seat of a cruiser and driven to the Nashua Police Department headquarters, where he willingly gave police a DNA sample before being taken into an interrogation room for questioning. Meanwhile, over the next several hours, crime scene techs and law enforcement were able to gather a huge amount of information about what had happened earlier that afternoon and evening at the Domenico residence. Chris, along with neighbors who had a clear view of Jean's property, helped police establish that Jean had arrived home from work that afternoon at about 5:30 p.m., carrying boxes of pizza she had picked up from a restaurant called Chow's. Jean had missed her daughter Nicole and Billy by about an hour. The 2 teenagers had been spotted at 4:30 p.m. playing tag in the Domenico's big backyard before hopping into Billy's car and heading to a local 7-Eleven convenience store, where Billy's black Cavalier was later seen by an on-duty police officer who had also stopped at the same 7-Eleven. Both Nicole and Chris had called Jean's phone around 7 p.m. without getting an answer. Nicole had called because she wanted to tell her mom not to expect her and Billy for dinner. It was Billy's last day in Nashua, and he and Nicole wanted to spend the time alone. When Nicole had not been able to reach her mom, she'd left a message on Chris's phone letting him know that she and Billy would be going bowling and then shopping at the local mall. The unanswered calls that both Chris and Nicole had made to Jean suggested to law enforcement that by 7 p.m., Jean was most likely already dead. As for the crime scene itself, Jean's attacker seemed to have made very little effort to cover their tracks. Whoever had killed Jean had left behind a partial bloody handprint on the refrigerator, suggesting that they had not worn gloves and may have left other DNA traces inside of the house. Police were also able to determine the kinds of weapons that had been used to kill Jean, even finding a piece of one weapon in the kitchen sink and another weapon that the killer may have dropped outside. As for motives and suspects, initial interviews with Jean's neighbors had already turned up several possible leads. Even though the neighbors gathering outside were all telling police the same thing, that Jean was genuinely and universally liked and even loved by her friends, coworkers, and acquaintances, it wasn't long before Nashua detectives Dennis Linehan and Richard Sprankle had added names other than Chris McGowan to their people of interest list. Neighbors immediately pointed to Jean's ex-husband, Anthony Kasinkas. Jean had said outright to several friends that she was afraid of him, and police would soon learn that Anthony had a criminal record for threatening a person by firing off a shotgun in their direction. And some neighbors even whispered that police should track down Jean's own son. Charlie had a reputation for hanging out with a bad group of kids and for such violent displays of temper that for a long time, Jean refused to keep any sharp knives in the house for fear that Charlie might attack her or his sister. Shocked by the violence of the scene, Detective Sprankle also wondered if the murder could possibly be related to gang violence, evidence of which had recently begun to surface in downtown Nashua, where certain walls and buildings had been covered with gang-related graffiti. And as Jean's children arrived at the scene, the feeling of shock and tragedy that now hung over the cozy Cape House just kept growing. Portable floodlights had turned the crime scene tape a neon yellow, and through the windows, Jean's neighbors could see the bulky shape of crime scene techs in protective clothing moving from one room to another. Charlie was the first of Jean's children to arrive. Emerging through the crowd outside his family home, he approached police, asking what was going on and where his mother and sister were. After being informed that his mother was dead, uniformed officers seated him inside of a cruiser and drove him to the police station where he waited for the arrival of his father, Anthony Kasinkas. As Jennifer Ballou watched the scene unfold from her house next door to Jean's, she felt her heart sink at the thought of Charlie's sister, Nicole. Nicole had babysat regularly for Jennifer, and the two had become close. Jennifer knew how difficult the last few years had been for Nicole, and even though Jean and Nicole had argued over Nicole's relationship with Billy, Jennifer also knew how much Nicole relied on and loved her mom. Already in a vulnerable place, Jennifer knew that Nicole's life was about to get much, much harder. By the time Nicole and Billy arrived at the house at about 10:15, Nashua police officers already had 4 suspects awaiting interrogation at the Nashua Police Department. They were also making room for a parade of neighbors who were there to give witness statements, each arriving in a separate police cruiser so no 2 witnesses could compare and possibly change their stories. It wasn't long before Nicole and Billy were also taken down to the station. With round, dark eyes, Nicole had stared at the house where she lived and where she had just been playing tag in the backyard 6 hours earlier. Nicole barely seemed to register Billy's quick kiss on her lips. A few minutes later, and she was sliding into the cool interior of a black and white cruiser, headed to the Nashua police station 10 minutes to the south. After Nicole left, Billy remained at the scene with one of the police detectives. When Billy was young, his family's home had caught fire, and ever since then, as he told the investigator, he'd reacted with a lot of anxiety to the sound and sight of the flashing blue and red lights on emergency vehicles. Even though Billy did not know Nicole's family that well, as he and the detective chatted, Billy immediately agreed to help the police with their investigation, and by 10:30 p.m., he was happy to get away from the commotion and flashing lights at Nicole's house. He too was making the short trip south to a police station that now seemed to be overflowing with witnesses and suspects. For police detectives Linehan and Sprankle, it was a very busy night. Their main focus was on the interrogation of Jean's fiancé and her ex-husband, Anthony. Distracted and upset by the sight and feel of Jean's blood all over his bare arms, hands, and knees, as well as the patches of her blood that stained his shirt and shorts, Chris seemed to have a hard time concentrating on the questions, let alone accepting the fact that Jean had been murdered. Jean's ex-husband had given police permission to question Nicole and Charlie. Anthony himself was civil without being overly helpful. But once police had confirmed Anthony's alibi, they realized he did not seem to have any useful information anyway, and so from then on, he was present at the station only as the legal guardian of his two now motherless children. But even though investigators had ruled out Anthony as Jean's killer, they already knew they were making progress. Given the amount of physical evidence from the crime scene and leads from witness statements and their interview with Chris, they were confident that it would only be a matter of time and getting the forensics and autopsy reports before they identified Jean's killer. Still, they never expected that the breakthrough they were looking for would come so early in their investigation. And when the tip did come in, it came from a witness, not from a suspect. As Detective Linehan was out in the hallway looking for a larger room where Billy could wait for someone to take his statement, another detective, Mark Schaff, had noticed something interesting during the interview he was conducting with one of the witnesses. It was just a slip of paper, but it might be important. After describing his find to Detective Linehan, both investigators went still for just a moment. The air conditioning in the station was broken, and the heat from the day had been trapped inside, making everyone feel sticky and uncomfortable. Pulling his collar a bit looser, Detective Linehan decided this information was significant enough that he needed to follow up on it in person. By the time the sun rose 5 hours later on Thursday, August 7th, what the veteran detective was about to discover would become front-page headlines for weeks to come. Based on that conversation and follow-up interviews with other witnesses, here is a reconstruction of what happened to Jean Domenico on the evening of Wednesday, August 6, 2003, inside her home at 6 Dumaine Avenue. After arriving home from work at about 5:30, Jean rolled right into her usual routine, letting the dogs out to do their business in the backyard, collecting and sorting the mail, checking phone messages, and tidying up the house. By the time she sat down to relax on the living room sofa, Jean was more than ready to spend a few minutes doing nothing more than enjoying the smell of pizza wafting up from the boxes on the kitchen table. After this past week, when the house had felt so crowded with people and teenage emotions, she welcomed the quiet before Chris and eventually Nicole, Billy, and Charlie arrived for dinner. So, when Jean heard the front door open a few minutes later, she looked at her watch in surprise. Chris would not be here for another hour, and it seemed early for the kids to be home, and Jean's surprise only intensified when she looked up and recognized her visitor. While Jean had been settling herself on the sofa, her killer had been cutting through the parking lot off Deerwood Drive behind Jean's house. Once Jean's backyard was in sight, the killer hesitated, but only for a moment. The plan was in motion, and there was no real doubts about what had to be done. By the time the killer had walked along the side of the backyard and cut across the front yard to the front steps, the killer felt committed and ready. Flinging open the door, the killer stepped inside. After saying hello to a startled Jean, the killer continued walking past her into Charlie's first-floor bedroom. Reaching behind the door of that bedroom, the killer pulled out an aluminum baseball bat. Closing the door, the killer then walked back out to the kitchen, where Jean was now standing next to the stove, a puzzled look on her face. Stepping toward the open entrance from the kitchen into the living room, the killer stopped and, turning to face Jean, lifted the bat and gave it an experimental swing. "I hate the Yankees," the killer said, referring to New York's Major League Baseball team. At this, Jean, who loved baseball, relaxed a little and went back to sitting on the couch and offering a few observations about recent sports news. It wasn't until the cordless phone on the small table next to the sofa rang and the killer immediately reached over Jean to answer it that time suddenly seemed to rush forward in a blur. After just a moment of listening to the conversation, Jean was raising her voice in anger. And as she turned to walk into the kitchen, thinking that any kind of movement might help her collect herself after recognizing the caller on the other end of the line, the killer suddenly lunged forward toward Jean. Then the killer swung the baseball bat in the direction of Jean's head. But instead of delivering a single blow that would stun Jean or crush her skull, the bat missed Jean's head. Instead, it hit her straight across her back and sent her staggering against the wall. Shocked and hurt, Jean righted herself and turned to look back. But even as she did so, her attacker swung the bat a second time. And this time, the bat hit Jean squarely on the back of her head, causing what the medical examiner would later describe as a large split in the bone of her skull. Still, not only did Jean stay on her feet, she fought back. A few seconds later, and the two of them had crashed onto the glass coffee table in the living room, snapping the wooden legs and showering the carpet with shattered glass. Despite her injuries, Jean would break free from her attacker 2 more times before her killer managed to dodge past her into the kitchen and grab a knife from the butcher block on Jean's counter. Rounding again on Jean, the killer struck. The first blow to Jean's upper right shoulder was so hard that the knife blade broke off from the wooden handle. Dropping the handle onto the floor, the killer reached again for the butcher block. Grabbing a second knife, the killer stabbed Jean twice in the throat before dropping that knife onto the kitchen floor. But as her attacker started to turn away, Jean picked the knife up and once again pushed herself to her feet. Shocked, her attacker watched as Jean tried to run towards them before slipping and falling in her own blood. As she fell, Jean's head bumped almost gently against her killer's side before hitting the plexiglass in the back door with enough force to push the panel completely out of its frame. Grabbing a third knife, Jean's killer straddled her fallen body and began stabbing, delivering more than a total of 40 blows to Jean's head, neck, back, arms, and hands before finally standing and looking down at her dark, blood-soaked hair and profile. Pausing before going into the bathroom to clean up, the killer listened as Jean struggled to breathe before speaking her final words. "Okay," she whispered, "I'm done." About 15 minutes after the killer had left the house, the back door at 6 Dumaine Avenue opened again. But this time, the visitor had to push hard enough to move Jean's body out of the way in order to enter the house. Once inside, the visitor looked down at the single mother of 2 lying in a pool of blood, and then very casually and carefully stepped over the body. Cleaning up the scene would be difficult, but the important thing was to avoid leaving footprints. So, picking their way through the splashes of blood that seemed to cover everything, not only the floors from the kitchen out through the living room, but also the walls and even the ceiling. The visitor was soon hard at work, scrubbing away handprints, gathering up the baseball bat and knives, and bundling everything, including bloody clothes the killer had left in the bathroom, inside a jacket. And then, straightening up and pushing her long dark hair out of her face, Jean Domenico's 16-year-old daughter, Nicole, gave a final look around the house. The smell of the pizzas on the kitchen table lost in the coppery scent of her mother's blood. Moving with the same care she had used coming into the house, Nicole once again stepped over her mother's body, and then, with a sigh of relief, Nicole closed the kitchen door behind her. Billy had done his part. He had kept his promise to Nicole that he would kill her mother so he and Nicole could be together for the rest of their lives, and now Nicole had done her part too. She had gone back to the house, cleaned up Billy's mess, and picked up the inhaler he needed to control his asthma. Earlier, when Billy had returned to the lot at the nearby 7-Eleven convenience store after killing Jean, Nicole had been waiting for him, reading a teen magazine she enjoyed while leaning against the hood of his black Chevy Cavalier. Nicole had been surprised by how much blood Billy still had on him, even after he had run upstairs before leaving the house to get a clean shirt out of the suitcase he had left in her bedroom. Nicole was also surprised at how angry and agitated Billy seemed. She'd known almost as soon as she called her home number, maybe 30 minutes earlier, and Billy had answered the phone, that her mother was still alive, because Nicole could hear her mother's voice in the background asking Billy if he was speaking to Nicole, and then hearing her mom plead directly with Nicole, asking her to please just come home. Nicole had had to shout at Billy to just do it, get it done, because how else would the two of them be able to start a life together unless Nicole's mother was dead? And Nicole had also known that her call to Billy had just made him upset. Still, it surprised her that once her mother was gone, that this reunion with Billy in the 7-Eleven parking lot wasn't more romantic and satisfying. And seeing all that blood on Billy, Nicole didn't really want to go back to the house, but Billy had made her, saying that cleaning up the murder scene had been Nicole's part of the bargain. It had been very hard stepping over her mother's body and not even being completely sure her mom was actually dead yet, But Nicole had done it. And then the two of them, Billy and Nicole, had driven to the Pheasant Lane Mall so Billy could clean up and get more clean clothes, and so they could get rid of the baseball bat, the knives, and those bloody clothes by dumping them at the deserted wooded edge of Overlook Golf Course located one town over. But once Nicole and Billy went back to the house at 6 Dumaine Ave, thinking they had committed the perfect crime and set up perfect alibis for themselves, everything started to fall apart. Nicole just had no way of knowing that later that night they would both be questioned by police and that some detective would notice the receipt for the new clothes Billy was wearing sticking out of Nicole's shirt pocket. And once that detective had started asking Nicole all kinds of questions about where she and Billy had been that afternoon and evening, it was impossible to keep all the lies straight. And soon the detective was talking to another detective who went and talked to Billy, and pretty soon the story Nicole told wasn't matching the story Billy was telling. And that's when Nicole just broke down in tears and told the detective everything that happened. Except that in Nicole's mind, even though it had been her idea to kill her mother, it was all Billy's fault because he was the one who actually did the killing. It would turn out that 3 days into Billy's visit to 6 Dumaine Avenue, Jean was so alarmed at the intensity of the relationship between Billy and Nicole that she told the two teenagers that Billy would need to end his visit early. She wanted him gone first thing in the morning on Thursday, August 7th. Jean also made it clear to Nicole that Jean was not interested in having Billy come visit again, or in letting Nicole go visit Billy. And after Billy's outburst at Jean during that family dinner on Sunday when Billy accused Jean of insulting Billy's mother, Jean had also begun to suspect that not only was Billy manipulating Nicole, he also had serious anger issues. What Jean had no way of knowing was just how correct those suspicions were. Ever since the age of 5, Billy had shown signs of depression, anxiety, and bipolar disorder, a mental health condition that causes major mood swings. Billy had also been hospitalized at least 5 times for psychiatric problems, including an episode in which he had attacked his mother with a baseball bat. The agitation that police noticed in Billy when he and Nicole appeared at the crime scene on the night of August 6th may have been triggered by the bad memories he associated with flashing emergency lights, but it was also a physical symptom that indicated he was not taking the medications prescribed to treat his mental illness. In the 15 months since Nicole had met Billy online, Nicole and Billy had held a mock wedding ceremony, and by late 2002 had begun referring to one another as husband and wife and Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan. They also had both written letters to Jean asking that she allow Nicole to move to Connecticut and live with Billy. And when Jean said no, absolutely not, Nicole and Billy started talking about other ways to be together. Running away to another state, or getting Nicole a legal separation from her family. And even though Billy had at least one other girlfriend besides Nicole, he and Nicole made lists of what they would buy for their new apartment and life together. When Jean finally put her foot down and told Nicole and Billy on Monday, August 4th that they needed to end their relationship, the two teenagers would spend the next 3 days conspiring to kill Nicole's mother, the one person who stood between them and their dreams of the life they would spend together. In the early morning hours of August 6th, seated in separate interrogation rooms at the Nashville Police Department, Billy and Nicole each confessed to the brutal murder of Jean Domenico. In all, the life they had dreamed of together had lasted less than 5 hours, and the last time Billy and Nicole kissed or saw each other until their cases went to trial was just outside the house at 6 Dumaine Ave, where Jean's body would remain lying in its pool of drying blood until the next day. The news of Nicole's arrest stunned not only her family, but everyone who had known Jean. But that was not the last of Nicole's revelations. It would turn out that Nicole and her boyfriend had made 4 previous attempts on Jean's life in the days leading up to the murder. First, they had laced her coffee creamer with over-the-counter drugs and then with bleach. Neither attempt at poisoning worked. The drugs caused the episodes of dizziness that Chris would later blame on Jean's restrictive diet. The smell of bleach made Jean throw the creamer away without drinking any of it. The third murder attempt, starting a fire in Jean's bedroom and then locking Jean inside, failed when the flame-retardant mattress in Jean's bedroom would not catch fire. Their fourth attempt to kill Jean by running a gasoline-soaked length of rope through an outside window into the oil tank and then setting the rope and eventually the oil inside the tank on fire ended when Chris came out of the house and saw them. Panicking, Nicole threw the rope into a nearby garbage can. By Wednesday afternoon, August 5th, Billy and Nicole had decided to kill Jean with the baseball bat they knew was behind the door of Charlie's bedroom. They would create alibis with the story they told Chris about spending the dinner hour at the local bowling alley, and they also assumed the police would suspect that Jean was the victim of a robbery gone wrong. On March 28, 2005, almost 1.5 years after Jean's murder, Nicole avoided a charge of first-degree murder by pleading guilty to lesser charges of second-degree murder and agreeing to testify against the love of her life, Billy Sullivan. Nicole was sentenced to a minimum of 35 years in prison. 4 months later, on July 15th, after an unsuccessful attempt to plead guilty by reason of insanity, Billy was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. After Jean's murder, Nicole's brother, Charlie, went to live with his father, Anthony Kasinkas. Birch Elementary School in Nashua, where Jean had once worked as a volunteer, member of the parent-teacher organization, and a teacher's aide, dedicated a granite bench in her honor that stands outside the school's entrance. On May 22, 2004, the city of Nashua renamed one of its Little League baseball fields the Jean Domenico Ballpark. 24-year-old Gina Allen and her brand new boyfriend, 28-year-old Brandon Day, could not believe their luck. For the past 48 hours, they had been stranded in the rugged wilderness of the San Jacinto mountain range in California when they looked down into this ravine and they saw a campsite. There was a tarp that had been strung up between two trees. And so they ran over to it hoping that the owner of this campsite would be in there and they could help them get out of these mountains. But when they got to the campsite, there wasn't anyone there. But from the looks of it, it looked like someone had been living in this site fairly recently. Underneath this makeshift roof from this tarp was a sleeping pad, there was a warm sweater, there was shoes, there was a disposable razor, some kitchen utensils, and there was a yellow backpack. Without any hesitation, Brandon and Gina, who were totally famished and they're exhausted and they're desperate, they just start rifling through the different things in camp, hoping to find some things that will help save their life, like a cell phone or a radio, or even just a lighter or some matches or some food. And so Brandon focused on all the items that are just kind of laying out under the tarp, and Gina focused on the contents of the yellow backpack. And so Gina, she opens up this backpack and she starts pulling out all these maps that are inside. And she notices on the margins of these maps in the white space, there is handwriting, and it's done in pen, and it looks like it's been written fairly recently. Now, at first, she didn't read any of the notes that were on these margins. She was just kind of pulling them out and stacking them on the ground next to her and continuing to rummage through this bag. But at some point, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed on the top map that was sitting on the ground next to her, there was a particular note at the top of the page that as soon as she saw it, she stopped what she was doing, she turned and looked at it. She couldn't believe what she was seeing, and in fact, she didn't want to get her hopes up, but she slowly reached over, she picked the map up, and she put it right in front of her face, and as soon as she was reading it, she just started laughing. She was so happy, she was so relieved, she yelled to Brandon to come over and look at this. And so Brandon stopped what he was doing, he turned around, and he bent down, and he looked exactly where she was looking, and when he read what she had read, he started laughing too. They were saved. There, at the top of this map, there was a note that was dated the same date as the day they were there, May 8th. And so they knew whoever had written this had written it at least in the last couple of hours because it was May 8th. And so they had to be around here somewhere. And so Gina and Brandon, they stand up and they start yelling out for the owner of this camp to please come out and help them. But in their excitement, Brandon and Gina had overlooked a critical detail in this note. And it would turn out that critical detail would change their lives and the life of the man who owned this camp forever. Before Brandon and Gina ever began their doomed hike into the San Jacinto mountain range, another man, one which neither of them knew, was gearing up for a hike of his own that would take him through the San Jacinto mountain range. His name was John Donovan, and on April 19th, 2005, which was the day he would begin this journey, he was 59 years old. John had absolutely no family. He was born an only child, and by the time he was 10 years old, he had been orphaned and basically had to raise himself from that point onward. By the time John was in his 20s, he had moved to Virginia, where he had taken a job as a social worker. And despite making a fairly decent salary, he refused to spend any more money than he absolutely had to. It was a habit he had developed as an orphan child trying to make ends meet with virtually no money whatsoever, and as an adult, that habit just never left him. So as a result, for his entire life, all the way up until he left for that hike in 2005, he never had anything nice. He basically wore the exact same outfit virtually every single day. He never owned a car, he never owned a phone, he never owned a computer, and when it came to where he chose to live, he would always live in the most absurdly cheap dwellings possible, which included at one point living in a partially burned down, abandoned savings bank with no heat. John was a proud Irish Catholic, he drank lots of whiskey, he swore like a sailor, and he had no problem speaking his mind no matter who he was talking to. While he was a lovely person once you got to meet him, his unorthodox lifestyle and his at times gruff exterior made it pretty difficult for him to make friends for most of his life. But when he was in his 40s, he wanted to lose some weight, and so he decided to join a hiking club. And to his surprise, the other members of this hiking club adored him. They thought he was hysterical, and he made being out on the trails so much more fun and enjoyable. And before long, all these members of this club became John's family that he never had. And so John would go on every single trip this hiking club went on, no matter what. That was the most important thing to him in his life. When it came to hiking, though, John was a bit of an anomaly. Even though he would hike sometimes over 4,000 miles in any given year, he would still routinely get lost on trails he had been on dozens and dozens of times. But despite being totally self-aware of this fatal flaw in his hiking abilities, John rarely did anything to compensate for it. For example, he didn't bring with him on most hikes a compass, which would be the first thing you would think to bring with you to stay oriented. Also, because he refused to buy a phone, he didn't have that to aid him either if he ever got lost. In fact, John rarely brought much of anything on any hike he went on, because John is what you would call a ultralight backpacker, which basically meant you would only pack the absolute bare essentials, and in John's case, sometimes less than the absolute bare essentials. And despite his friends trying repeatedly to get him to pack more equipment so he was more prepared, he would always say, no, he knows what he's doing and everything is good. And the truth is, John always did manage to get from point A to point B on all of his hikes, some of which included extremely difficult hikes, like the time he hiked the 500-mile-long Colorado Trail, or the time he hiked the 2,175-mile-long Appalachian Trail. Now, John would tell you that was all skill, but his friends would say John was extremely lucky. He would get lost, and then at the last second he would find the trail again, or he would lose some piece of critical equipment, and then just someone on the trail would happen to walk by that had an extra set of whatever it was that John needed. And then one time when John was in Poland on a hike, he slipped on this icy embankment where earlier that day, 2 other hikers had slipped and fallen to their deaths. And John has now slipped on this same embankment. He's careening down the sides. He's flailing. He can't stop himself. And then the drawstring on his pants gets caught up in a tree, and that arrests his fall and it saves his life. And so from that point on, John would only wear those pants when he went hiking, and he called them his lucky pants. In the spring of 2005, John and one of his very close hiking friends named Ken Baker, who was roughly his age, decided they were going to hike the 2,650-mile-long Pacific Crest Trail. This trail spanned the entire west coast of the United States. It starts in Southern California, right on the border of Mexico, and it goes all the way up to the very northern end of Washington State, right on the border of Canada. It takes the average hiker, if they're going to do this entire trail in one go, about 5 months, unless there's bad weather conditions that impede them along the way. John had been excitedly planning this epically long hike for the better part of the last year. He had actually typed out 6 pages on his typewriter of this itinerary that planned out every single detail of this hike, down to how many ounces of coffee he would need at every stop along the way. John was especially excited about this particular hike because it was going to be the very first hike he would be doing after his retirement from being a social worker. And apparently John had huge plans for his retirement. He wanted to travel all over the United States. He wanted to go to Australia, to China, to Russia. He basically wanted to hike at least 6 months a year, every single year, until he was too old or too weak to continue to do so. But just a couple of days before John and Ken were supposed to fly out to California to begin the Pacific Crest Trail, Ken told John that he thought they should actually postpone the start of this trip by about 3 weeks. He said Southern California had experienced their snowiest winter in decades, and so it would make sense to wait a little bit of extra time to make sure all the snow had melted and that they didn't get caught in any sort of late snowstorm. Now, John was totally not having this. He had spent so much time thinking about this trip. He was so excited about it that he just couldn't wait any longer. And so he told Ken, "I'm sorry, I'm going on the current timeline, whether I go alone or not." And so on April 19th, 2005, John made his way to his office where he was a social worker. His coworkers threw him a very small retirement party, and he literally left the office, went straight to the airport, and he flew to Southern California all alone. When he got there, he took a chance and reached out to one of his other hiking friends, a 48-year-old tool salesman named Lynn Padgett, and asked him, hey, I know you live in the area. Would you be interested in coming on at least part of the Pacific Crest Trail with me? I'm going to start here in the next couple of days. And John was extremely excited when Lynn said, you know what? Sure, I'd love to come along with you. And the two of them made their way over to Campo, California, which is right on the border of Mexico, and they began their hike along the Pacific Crest Trail. But after going only about 100 miles, Lynn's feet started swelling so badly that he could not go any farther. And so from that point onward, John would be alone. The San Jacinto mountain range is the first major mountain range that the northbound Pacific Crest Trail hikers will encounter, and statistically, it's actually the most dangerous portion of the Pacific Crest Trail, as 15% of all the fatalities that occur along this huge trail occur in the San Jacinto mountain range. It's a very steep mountain with a rapid rise in elevation from the desert floor all the way up to over 10,000 feet, which means in the summer, even when it's extremely hot down around the base of this mountain, it will probably be windy and snowing at the top. John reached the base of the San Jacinto mountain range on May 2nd, and as he began his slow climb up, all of the hikers he was encountering were all talking about the same thing. There was apparently some big snowstorm that was due to hit the San Jacinto mountain range in the next couple of days, and so all of these hikers were actually evacuating the mountain to go to this little town to wait out the storm. Everyone's fear was they would get caught on Fuller Ridge when the storm hit. Fuller Ridge is towards the top of the San Jacinto mountain range, and it's probably the most dangerous part of the entire mountain range. It's basically this totally exposed, very steep section where if you lose your footing, there's nothing to stop you from tumbling down to your death. But when John heard this, he wasn't fazed at all. He was not about to evacuate because of some storm. He was just going to continue up this mountain, go over Fuller's Ridge, and carry on along the Pacific Crest Trail. And so for the rest of the day, he just continued up the mountain and eventually made camp about halfway up. He actually stopped near two other hikers that were also going to push through despite this storm. It was a 46-year-old nurse from Canada named Connie Davis and her son, 20-year-old Alex. And they were both very experienced high-altitude climbers, and they had all the right gear, and they were very well prepared. And so that night, after both parties had set up their camp, they struck up a friendly conversation, during which John made some dismissive comments about Connie's parenting style that really agitated her, although it didn't seem like John really noticed he had upset her. And so needless to say, the next morning, Connie and her son had packed up and were long gone by the time John was waking up. So John just got up, he looked at the sky, it was still clear, although he did see some gray clouds rolling in, so he could sense that yes, a storm really is on the way, but he decided he was still just going to continue on towards Fuller Ridge. So he put his backpack on and he began walking up the trail, and a little while later, when he was nearing Fuller Ridge, but was still several miles away, three very well-equipped hikers that he had not seen before came charging down the path towards him. And John stopped them and he said, hey, how is it up there? What's the weather like? What's Fuller Ridge like? And they kind of looked at John and sized him up, looking up and down, and they saw that, he's got light clothes on, he's got sneakers on, he doesn't have trekking poles, he just looks totally ill-prepared for what he's walking into. And they said to him, I don't think it's a good idea for you to continue on here. This storm is going to hit any time now, and we're not going to Fuller Ridge. We're actually turning around and leaving because of the storm, and we have all the right gear. You should really consider turning around and leaving. But these three hikers would say there was just no way they were going to change John's mind. He was totally dead set on carrying on to Fuller Ridge. And so the three men that had told him not to go eventually just said, okay, good luck. And they carried on down the trail and John continued up. But despite John's earlier confidence in his plan to go to Fuller Ridge and continue through San Jacinto Mountains, when the snow actually started to fall sometime in the mid-afternoon, John started to have doubts about his plans. There was already a lot of snow on the ground where he was from previous snowstorms, and that was making it hard to see the trail as it was. And now with all this additional snow starting to dump down, he was worried it was going to totally cover up the trail and he would lose it. And since he knew he kind of had a penchant for getting lost on trails, this was a real concern. But he was still very stubborn, and so despite these second thoughts, he just continued on along. And so after a while, he got to within maybe 1 or 2 miles of Fuller Ridge when he spotted up ahead of him 2 other hikers that seemed to be going in that direction. And so he ran up to them and he yelled for them to stop. And at this point, the snow is really starting to come down and the trail is completely wiped out and he can barely see in front of him. And these 2 hikers, they stop. And so he runs up to them. And when he gets up close, he can see it's actually Connie Davis and her son Alex from the night before. And so Connie is obviously not thrilled to see John again, but when he explained that he was having a really hard time staying on the trail and, could he just tag along with them, Connie said, you know what, that's just fine, we're happy to have you. But she explained to him she was not going up to Fuller Ridge. Instead, she was taking a more circuitous route that would bypass the ridge. It would take a lot longer, but it would be safer given the weather conditions. John assured her that that was totally fine. He would just trail along with them, and then at some point he would break off on his own and he would go up to Fuller Ridge and they could go their separate way. And so Connie, her son, and John begin walking along together. Now, Connie and Alex, they had crampons on their shoes, which are basically like metal cleats and allow you to very easily grip the snow and ice. They had trekking poles, they had all the right warm gear, and so they're easily moving along through these weather conditions. Meanwhile, John didn't have trekking poles or any high-speed equipment. He did have crampons that he tried to put onto his shoes, but because he had sneakers that were not lined up to this type of crampon, they didn't really fit right, and so it caused him to constantly stumble and fall on the ground. And so that's how it went for a while until Connie and Alex reached this critical point. It was at this creek where they needed to go down and around, which would take them away from Fuller Ridge. And if John was going to continue, like he said he would, up to Fuller Ridge, that would be the point where he would break off from them and go up the mountain towards this ridge. And so Connie and Alex wait at the stream. They're turned around and they're looking back down the trail at John, who's fallen way behind at this point. And as they're looking at him, they're thinking, this is going to take a long time for him to finally catch up to us. And so Connie, who really wasn't all that keen in hanging around John that much longer anyways, she figured, you know what, John has made his intentions completely clear. He said he is going up to Fuller Ridge. He is an adult. He is healthy. He can do whatever he wants. And so she yelled and waved to John and signaled that she and her son were going to go down this creek and this way to Fuller Ridge, so best of luck to you. And then Connie and Alex disappeared around the corner. Once John's hiking partners had gone, John got up to that creek and he was going to try to go up to Fuller Ridge, but by that point the snow was practically blinding, and so at this point John decided, you know what, I do need to turn around and go back down the mountain and evacuate to that town where everybody else had gone to avoid the storm. And so John turns around and starts trying to backtrack along this trail back down the mountain, but the trail is gone. The snow has completely whited it out, and there's no other hikers anywhere nearby, and even if there were, he wouldn't be able to see them. And so for several hours, while it was still light out, John did his best to navigate down the mountain, and then when the sun went down, he really had no idea where he was. And so instead of trying to stay on this trail that at this point he really didn't think he was on, he looked out away from the mountain, and way down below, he saw this big bright cluster of lights. Even through the falling snow, he could clearly see those were lights of a city. And so he decided he would use that as kind of like his North Star, and he would just continuously walk downhill towards those lights. And so for several hours, he just began walking towards these lights, narrowly avoiding huge drop-offs and climbing over boulders and avoiding trees and animals. And finally, he got to this very critical point in his journey down to these lights. He reached this area called Long Valley, where he had a decision to make. He could either continue down the mountain, which would require jumping down into this ravine that once he did, he would not be able to climb back out again. It was too steep. Or he could turn around and hike way back up the mountain and go some other direction. But at this point, he had really no idea what direction was the best direction. All he knew is he needed to go down the mountain because his situation was getting worse and worse by the second. if he didn't find shelter soon, he might get hypothermia and just die out here. And so he decided he would jump down into this ravine. And so he laid on his stomach, he lowered himself down over the edge, and he dropped down into the valley below. Once he stood up, he just continued walking down the mountain, and at some point he spotted a stream that he began to follow along. And as he followed this ravine, which was taking him straight down the mountain, he noticed the ravine walls, these huge walls on either side of him, seemed to get closer and closer to him, like this ravine was kind of coming to a point. And then after a while, he noticed up ahead, the stream just kind of disappeared. And so he walked a little bit farther, and then he came to an abrupt stop. The water had disappeared because it had flown off a 100-foot cliff that he was now standing in front of. He had come to the edge of this huge waterfall, and there was absolutely no way to lower himself down over it. It was an absolute fall to the death if he attempted to go down this waterfall. And so he looked to his left and he looked to his right, and these huge canyon walls that had followed him all the way to this edge from when he dropped down, they were sheer cliffs. There was no way to climb those. And his initial drop into this ravine was unclimbable. He knew that going in. And so he was boxed in. He was trapped. And he likely knew that it would be at least a week or more before anybody figured out that he was even missing. And so totally disheartened, John left the edge of this cliff, this waterfall, and walked back up to a relatively flat area farther up the ravine, and he began to set up camp. He pulled out his green tarp, he put some line between two trees, he made a makeshift roof, he laid out his bed mat underneath, and then he climbed underneath the tarp and he settled in for a long night. The next morning, when the sun came up, John attempted to make a fire, but none of the wood he was finding was dry enough, so all of his fires just kind of smoldered but didn't really catch. He had a mirror, a signal mirror, and he was prepared to flag down any aircraft that flew overhead, but no aircraft did, so he didn't flag anyone down. And so by the end of that night, he was back under his tarp, having made no progress, settling in for another freezing cold, sleepless night. The next morning, when the sun finally came up again, John was totally disheartened, and he decided to start jotting notes down on the margins of his map, which was the only place he had space to write. He figured he would keep a sort of diary. That way, if he didn't get out of here, someone would figure out what happened to him. And so his first entry was that day, May 5th, and he wrote that his friend Ken was right. He should have postponed this trip by 3 weeks and avoided the bad weather. Ken was the smart one. And also in this May 5th entry, he took an inventory of his food supply. He said he only had 12 cheese crackers left. And then on May 8th, John wrote a note that said, took a fall, too weak to climb out of canyon, down is a gorge, no way out. This was the message that Gina and Brandon discovered when they stumbled on this campsite. But the significance of this note was not literally what he wrote, but rather when he wrote it. On May 6th, Brandon Day and his girlfriend, Gina Allen, were in Palm Springs for a business convention. Brandon was a financial advisor, and so he was out here for business, and Gina was his guest, so she was really just vacationing. And so towards the end of the convention, when Brandon had some free time, he and Gina decided to leave the hotel and go on a hike somewhere. And so they actually linked up with a tour group that was leaving the hotel, that was heading over to this tram station, where they were going to take a tram car all the way up to the top of the San Jacinto mountain range. A tram car is basically like a ski lift, except once you ride it to the top of the mountain, you don't do any skiing, you just do sightseeing. And so Brandon and Gina, they get to this tram car, they hop inside, they get to the top, and it's totally amazing, beautiful view, there's snow at the top, and they're told they have about 20 or 30 minutes before their group is going to take the tram car back down again. And so Brandon and Gina decide to kind of venture off away from the main group and have some alone time before they leave again. And as they kind of venture off, they start to hear what sounds like a waterfall. And so the two of them are kind of looking around, asking if they can see it or if they know where it is, and they don't. And so they say, hey, do you want to just leave the trail and walk towards this waterfall? It can't be far. It sounds like it's only maybe a couple of minutes away. We'll take some pictures, we'll come back, and then we'll catch the tram back down again. And so they decide this is a great idea. They leave the path and they start walking towards the sound of this waterfall. But after walking for a pretty significant distance, they realize the sound of this waterfall is not getting any closer. It seems to actually just be getting farther and farther away. And what they didn't know was happening was the sound of the waterfall was actually echoing off the walls of this mountain. It was basically playing a trick on them. The acoustics made it seem like it was really close, but really it wasn't. It was pretty far away. And And so by the time they finally did locate this waterfall, they knew they had ventured fairly far off the main trail, and they really needed to hustle to get back up to the tram station to meet their group and catch that last car out. And so they took a couple of pictures of this waterfall and then quickly turned around and began booking it back towards the station. But on their return trip, which they believed they were going in the right direction, they started hearing the sound of voices coming from the tram station, but they were coming from a different direction. And so Gina and Brandon stopped and they're thinking, I think we got to go this way, but clearly that's the sound of the other people in our group coming from that direction. And so they decide to follow the sound of the voices. But just like the sound of the waterfall, the sound of the voices were not coming from that direction. That was just an echo bouncing off the walls. It was basically a trick the mountain was playing on Brandon and Gina. And so they start walking in the wrong direction, and after walking for quite a while and not getting anywhere nearer the tram station, the voices just finally stop. And they look at their watches and they realize they missed the cutoff. They missed the last tram. All those tourists they were with, they've left. They are now alone somewhere out in the middle of the mountains. But they did not panic. They figured, you know what? We'll just make our way to the tram station and we'll either catch the next tram or, maybe there's a payphone or something up there we can use and, we'll figure it out. Now, it's important to mention that Brandon and Gina did not expect to spend very much time out in the elements. They expected to get on a tram, stay at the top of this tram station with a bunch of other tourists where there was a restaurant and a bar, and then they were going to ride that tram car back down and be back at their hotel before dinner time. As such, they didn't bring any supplies. They didn't even have their cell phones. They had left those in the hotel room because they wanted to make sure they were focused on each other. And so all they had were the clothes on their back, which were very light. They had tank tops and some sweatpants on. They each had a very light jacket as well. And they had a wallet and some chapstick. They had no water. They had no food. And so Brandon and Gina, they begin walking around in search of this tram station. And for several hours, despite their best efforts, they don't find it. And then before long, the sun is going down and the temperature is dropping rapidly. And so eventually, after it becomes too dark to continue to move around, the couple winds up going into a cave where they huddle up all night, barely avoiding becoming hypothermic. The next day, when the sun comes up, they haven't slept at all, they climb out of their cave, and they continue walking around the mountain in hopes they find this tram station. But eventually, they get to one of the higher points of the area they were in, and they have a pretty good vantage point around them, and when they start looking out, they don't see the tram station, they don't see anything but wilderness in all directions. And so they decided their best bet was just to walk straight down the mountain and try to just walk off the mountain. And they figured as they began walking down the mountain that the tour guide had probably recognized they were short 2 people the day before. And so certainly a search had been launched and there were people looking for them, and probably they would be found long before they ever had to actually walk off this mountain. But little did they know, their tour guide that had brought them onto the tram and then brought that group down, they had recognized they were short 2 people, but they assumed those 2 people must have just taken an earlier tram, and so nothing was reported. Nobody was looking for them. And so all day, Brandon and Gina made their way down this very steep mountain, falling half the time, smashing into rocks and trees, and getting cut up on manzanita bushes. It was just this awful experience, and by the time the sun was going down, they had no sense of how close they were to the bottom. They didn't have a good viewpoint. They were just kind of trapped inside of the wilderness. And so once again, they huddled up for the entire night. This time they didn't have a cave to protect them from the wind. And so it was just another absolutely miserable night. And so finally the sun comes up on the 3rd day, and Brandon and Gina, they're up and they are moving straight down this hill. They want to get out of there as soon as they can. And after smashing into more boulders and more trees and getting more banged up, they finally arrive at the same drop off down into a ravine in Long Valley that John had gotten to. And so they're standing over this ravine debating whether they should make the leap and jump down into this ravine, even though it means they can't climb out again. And so they're looking around, they're figuring, you know what, we don't really have a better choice. We don't really have the energy to climb all the way up and try to go a different way. And we don't even know if those ways are more advantageous. And so just like John, they turn around onto their stomachs, they grip the top of this drop off and then slip down into the ravine. Once they stand back up, they start walking down this ravine and they spot a river, and they run over to the river and they drink as much water as they possibly can. And it's a huge morale booster. And then they get back up again and they're continuing walking down the stream when off in the distance, they notice a green tarp strung up between trees. It was John's campsite. And so Brandon and Gina, they run over to this campsite and they eventually come across John's notes on the margins of his maps. But after standing up and yelling out for this owner to please come out here and help us, we need your help, we're lost, and then no one came out of the woods, no one heard them, no one responded, Brandon went back to the note and he looked at it again, and that's when he noticed it. The note had been written on May 8th. However, it had been written on May 8th, 2005. The year that Brandon and Gina were reading it was 2006. So this note was 1 year old. John had just happened to get lost and write a note on the exact same calendar day that Gina and Brandon arrived at his campsite and discovered the note. In their initial excitement and joy that they might get saved, they did not pick up on that year discrepancy. The couple began looking more closely at all of the gear underneath the tarp, and they noticed all of the metal objects like the forks and spoons and the pots and the pans, they were all starting to rust, and some of the other objects like the shoes looked like they had been sitting in the same spot for a really long time. They both started to get a really bad feeling about this campsite, like something terrible had happened there. Gina emptied the yellow backpack's contents onto the ground, and that's when they found a wallet. They opened it up and they pulled out an ID card, and it was John Donovan's ID card. So now they knew who had written the note and who owned this camp. Afterwards, Gina and Brandon laid out all of the maps to see if there were other messages that they had not read yet. And there were. There were 2 other additional messages after the May 8th message. On May 11th, John said he was celebrating his 60th birthday and that unfortunately he was down to his last 2 cheese crackers. And then in his final message on May 14th, John wrote, "Headed down to creek for water. Goodbye. Love you all." Devastated, the couple knew what they were reading were almost certainly John's last words, and his body was most likely somewhere around here. And then it dawned on the couple that if John, who seemed like an experienced hiker who had all this gear, if he had gotten trapped and died out here, then how did they stand any chance with no experience and no equipment? And so not knowing what else to do, Gina just rounded up all of John's things. She stuffed them into his yellow backpack, and then she shouldered the pack, and then she and Brandon just walked away from John's campsite and continued walking downhill, hoping that up ahead there was not going to be some gorge like John had mentioned in his May 8th note. But unfortunately, after walking for a little while, they reached that cliff with the 100-foot drop, with the waterfall going off the side of it, and they realized that they were trapped, same as John. There was nothing they could do. And so totally speechless and shocked, they just both sat down, they didn't look at each other, and they just sat there wondering what was going to happen next. And they both were thinking, this could be the place where I die. At some point, Gina kind of snapped out of her trance and she took John's backpack and she began rifling through it, pulling everything out all over again. And Brandon asked her, what are you doing? And she said, well, maybe there's something in here that we missed. Maybe there's a secret pocket or something in here that could help us. And so she rifles through this bag, and sure enough, she finds inside of a small pocket in the bottom of the bag was another bag, a little plastic bag, and inside of it were matches, and they were still dry. And so immediately the couple pull them out and they start to round up logs to try to make a fire, and as soon as they light it, it doesn't catch because all the logs in the area that were on the ground were wet from previous snowstorms and rainstorms. And so all night they tried lighting these fires, but they all just kind of smoldered out. And so eventually, after the sun went down, Gina and Brandon, who were totally disheartened, they went back up to John's campsite and they went under his tarp and they huddled together for another freezing cold night. The next morning, Brandon woke up because he actually did fall asleep, and Gina was still sleeping. And so Brandon decided to just leave the tarp and go out and get a breath of fresh air. He knew they were in a terrible position, but he just wanted to clear his head. So he stood up and he could barely stand. He was so achy and tired and he was so hungry, and he decided he would just walk down to the edge of this cliff and look out into the valley to see if maybe there was a way down. And so he walked along the river, stopping periodically to get a sip of water until he got to the very edge. And when he got there, he looked down and he saw something that he had not seen the day before. There, in a pool of water all the way down 100 feet down, was a body lying face down in a pool of water. And that body belonged to John Donovan. Brandon was too far away to actually confirm if that really was John, but he instantly knew. But instead of being scared or saddened or depressed by the sight, it kind of invigorated Brandon and reminded him that if he doesn't act, he and Gina were going to die too. And so Brandon decided he wasn't going to set some small campfire to try to signal someone. He was going to try to light the entire forest on fire. And so he walked back up to the campsite and he got the matches out from the backpack, and then he walked into the forest a ways that was right near the river and near their campsite, and he found this tree that was obviously dead, and he walked around gathering as much dry wood as he could, and he propped it up against this dead tree, and then he put as much kindling as he possibly could into this hole in the trunk of this dead tree. And after doing all this prep work, he got his matches out and he lit some of the kindling, and to his surprise, the tree caught on fire almost immediately. In fact, it burned so quickly and so big that Brandon had to run away so that he didn't catch on fire. And before long, all these trees are catching on fire, and he had to run all the way back to the campsite and wake Gina up. And so he grabs Gina, they get up, and they run all the way over to the edge of the waterfall, and they turn, and they're just watching half an acre just completely erupt in flames. And all this black smoke is billowing up into the sky. And then about an hour later, after the fire had eventually just kind of died out on its own, Gina and Brandon heard the distant rumblings of a helicopter. They had seen the smoke and they were coming to rescue them. Gina and Brandon would be airlifted out of the ravine and would make full recoveries. John Donovan's body would be recovered 3 weeks later. His cause of death could not be determined. Some say that final note he left on May 14th, where he said he was going down to the creek to get water and then said, "Goodbye, I love you all," that was sort of a suicide note, that he actually threw himself off that cliff to end his suffering. Others say he just walked down to the edge of this waterfall and was trying to get a drink of water from the creek when he slipped and then fell over the edge to his death. But we'll never know for sure. What we do know for sure is that in 2005, when John Donovan was still alive and missing, had he been rescued, he would have left the valley with all of his supplies, including those matches, which would have meant in 2006, when Brandon and Gina found themselves in that ravine, there wouldn't have been a way to start that fire, and so they would have died. In fact, the helicopter pilot that did come up and rescue Brandon and Gina, he would say there was nobody planning to search that area. This was not an area they believed Brandon and Gina would be. And so it really was only because of that fire that those two lived. As such, the couple said they owe their lives entirely to John Donovan and his unbelievable sacrifice. On July 11th, 2006, a funeral was held for John in Virginia. 80 people showed up for it. Most of them were his hiking friends from his club. After the service was over, they all kind of poured out onto the cemetery lawn around John's gravesite. And as the bagpipes played Amazing Grace, Lynn Paget, the man who had done the first 100 miles of the Pacific Crest Trail with John before his feet swelled up and he had to leave, he walked around the crowd handing out red Solo cups filled with a tiny bit of John's favorite whiskey. And then after making sure all of the adults had their drinks, Lynn went to the head of his very good friend's grave and he delivered a beautiful eulogy. In it, he tells the crowd that he thinks of John all the time, he misses him terribly, and at night he has the same dream. He's walking down this trail next to a stream, and then the stream bends off to the side, and as soon as he walks around the bend, he sees this green tarp. And he knows it's going to be John, and so he yells, "Hey comrade, hey comrade!" And as he's walking over to the tarp, he realizes John isn't there. All it is a tarp, a pack, and some shoes on a rock. As for Brandon and Gina, they did stay a couple after the ordeal, but they would ultimately break up 2 years later. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please sneak in to the 5-star review button's bedroom and heat up both sides of their pillow right before they go to sleep. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.